Hi, I'm Emma Shortis, and welcome to this bonus episode of After America. Today, we're bringing you an episode of the Australia Institute's new podcast series, What's the Point, with Richard Dennis. Every Monday, Richard cuts through the spin to explain the political and economic decisions that shape our lives. This week, Richard explores the return of One Nation as a force in Australian politics. If you want to hear more, you can subscribe to What's the Point with Richard Dennis. The video of every episode is available on YouTube, and audio-only versions are available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all your other favourite platforms. I hope you enjoy the show.
What's the Point is made on lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. We pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. Hi, and welcome to What's the Point? I'm Richard Dennis. Every week on this show, I'm going to take a look at the political and economic conversations and decisions that are shaping the lives of everyday Australians and answer key questions along the way. And if you've got questions of your own, or indeed a topic you want me to cover, send us a DM on Facebook or Instagram. This week we're talking about One Nation. For nearly 30 years, Pauline Hanson and One Nation have been a fixture of Australian politics. But despite all the attention they get, there's a surprisingly simple question that doesn't get asked very often. What's the point of One Nation? I've got the editor of The Point here with me, Anna Chang, for the first questions. Anna, fire away.
Hi, Richard. Why do you think One Nation's so popular at the moment?
Oh, good question, Anna. One of the reasons that Pauline Hanson is doing well is she's been talking about immigration for 30 years, and around the world, immigration has become an issue in democracies again. So we shouldn't be surprised that Pauline Hanson, who was afraid of being swamped by Asians way back in the 90s, is still kind of talking about a lot of these things, and we shouldn't be surprised that a lot of Australians still aren't happy with all of the answers they've had from the Labor governments and Liberal governments of the last 30 years. So one of the reasons that Hanson is surging at the moment is because the issue that she's always talked about is a topic of conversation around the world at the moment. But the main reason that the One Nation party has surged in the poll is because the coalition have tanked. I mean, let's be clear, back in 2019, Tony Abbott lost his seat to Zali Steggall, mainly because of his very, very strong view that climate change was a hoax and that, all of the things that people in his own seat were interested about, Tony Abbott was adamant they didn't matter. And he was so unpopular that he lost what was then one of the safest Liberal seats in the country. That was in 2019. In 2022, a whole bunch of more independents won seats off the Liberal Party. The Liberals didn't learn the lesson after Tony Abbott lost his seat. They didn't learn their lesson in the lead up to the 2022 election. And even then when they got smashed in 2022, lost a whole bunch more safe seats. Did they change? No. They went to Peter Dutton. Did he listen to inner city voters who used to vote Liberal? No, he didn't. What happened? He was one of the most unpopular Liberal leaders they've ever had. They moved to Susan Lee. Susan Lee tried to listen to former Liberal voters, but of course the Liberal Party and the National Party threw her out. And this collapse, absolute collapse in support for the Liberals and Nationals is one of the main reasons why the One Nation parties find so many voters are sitting around waiting for them. And then finally, again, there's not one reason that One Nation are doing well at the moment. There really is a lot of disenchantment in Australia right now. Of course there is. Real wages have fallen. Rents have been rising really fast. Young people know they can't afford to buy a house under the old rules. These problems have been building up for decades, and voters have got the shits. And fair enough too. So that's 3 reasons why, Anna. That's not all of it, but, that's a start.
You mentioned Susan Lee. People have talked about the Farrer by-election as proof that the One Nation effect is real. At The Point, we have published a piece by Alex Fine about foreign interference. So is it real or is it bots?
It's both. But let's start with the fact that Farah has always been a conservative electorate. It's been held by the coalition for, Susan Lee held it for decades, and it was before that it was held by the coalition for decades. So it's always been a conservative part of the world. So we shouldn't be surprised that now that the Liberal and National vote has tanked, that's one of the first places that One Nation have picked up support. And it's an historic win. We shouldn't diminish it. It's an historic win for One Nation to win that seat in the lower house. And at the same time, we have to be really careful to not draw too strong a conclusion about what this means. This is a very conservative electorate where One Nation's done well. Is that going to translate into Western Sydney? Is that going to translate into former Liberal seats? I don't think so, especially not if the Labor Party are smart enough, and, I hope they are, to actually change their agenda, change their messaging, and solve many of the material problems that people in regional Australia face. So One Nation winning in Farah, it is a big deal. It's proof that the Liberal National Party are in real trouble. That's the main significance of it. Is it obvious, therefore, that One Nation's going to roll across the country? No, not at all, because what's going on in Farah is quite different from what's going on in Western Sydney, let alone the inner city suburbs of Sydney or Melbourne or Perth or anywhere else. And then, of course, finally, Susan Lee represented that electorate for decades. By definition, people in Farah liked Susan Lee. And when the Liberal Party said, we don't like Susan Lee, we think she's a terrible leader, we want to get rid of Susan Lee, is anyone surprised that the voters of Farah, who'd been putting Susan Lee as number one on their ballot for decades, is anyone surprised that those people would turn away in droves from the Liberal Party or indeed the Nationals? So, yeah, again, there's lots going on in explaining what happened in Farah, but you really can't move past the fact that the people of Farah really liked Susan Lee, and the Liberal and National Party made clear they really didn't like Susan Lee. You couldn't do anything more clearly for the Liberal and National parties to show that they disagreed with and were out of touch with the views of the voters of Farah.
Journalists have been speculating about the future of Pauline Hanson and what this means for One Nation and the rise of One Nation. And even bookmakers have Pauline Hanson above Angus Taylor for preferred Prime Minister. How realistic is Pauline for PM?
Look, I don't think Pauline Hanson's going to be Prime Minister after the next election. She could be. It is not impossible. And we live in a democracy. If that's what an overwhelming number of Australians want, then that's what should happen. You'll always hear on election night people say that voters always get it right. So again, I think we have to kind of dig into this a little bit. On the one hand, when we ask people in an opinion poll, who might you vote for, far more of them are now saying One Nation. And indeed, One Nation have topped a number of polls in recent times. And similarly, when people have said, who's your preferred Prime Minister? A large number of people, often in some polls, the most people are saying Pauline Hanson. So this is real as a phenomena. People feel this way. But getting 30% of the vote or having 30% of the people think you be the best Prime Minister doesn't get you the Prime Ministership. To become Prime Minister, you have to be part of a party or a coalition that gets more than half of the seats in the House of Representatives. And the problem that Pauline Hanson has is that while at the moment there's around 30% of people who support her and think that her party might be the best party, by definition that means there's about 70% of people who don't think that. And what we know from the Farah election that we were just talking about is lots of people who voted One Liberal or One National did not preference One Nation ahead of the independent Michelle Milthorpe. So with 30% support, that's a lot. That is a significant achievement in a democracy. But 70% is a lot bigger than 30%. So if most of that 70% would prefer the Labor Party, the Greens or an independent, then while Pauline Hanson might pick up a lot of seats at the next election, I think it's very unlikely that she'll become Prime Minister after the next election. And then there's the media. And that's an important part of your question, Anna, because the media in Australia, the press gallery in particular, have for decades kind of had two stories in their mind. Is the leadership challenge on, and who's in front? And the so-called horse race of who's in front has dominated more recently because the is it on part, is the leadership challenge on part, has kind of disappeared as a story. So back when we had Gillard-Rudd, back when we had turnover from, Tony Abbott to Malcolm Turnbull to Scott Morrison, in those years, the press gallery had plenty to write about with the is it on story. But now they're stuck with who's in front. So Pauline Hanson's sort of shot to prominence has arisen, well, as I said before, as the Liberals and Nationals were falling to bits, but also at a time where, from the media's point of view, one of their favourite stories to write about is who's in front, who's going to win. When, of course, we're not going to have an election for 2 years. So who's in front today might help sell newspapers, it might generate clicks online, but it's not really the best indicator of who's going to form government after the next election. I mean, let's not forget Peter Dutton was in front in the polls for quite some time, and he went on to deliver one of the Liberal Party's biggest ever losses. So, yes, of course, it's interesting. The big swing in vote away from the Liberals and Nationals towards One Nation matters. The mood of Australians for change matters. But the idea that because Pauline Hanson's party is at 30% in the polls, again, a significant achievement, is not much of a predictor that they are likely to form government after the next election.
So in that case, what can Albo do to turn this around?
Well, Albo needs to turn this around for a number of reasons. One of the reasons that people are supporting One Nation in the polls is they're frustrated. They've seen for decades that things aren't getting better. Real wages are lower. The health system's not as good as it used to be. People are angry and want change. I think the big thing that they have to do, Anna, is they've got to get away from this idea of the announceables. The idea that if a government comes out with a little announcement that it can give to an old-fashioned newspaper and get a headline that says Albo announces new health policy, that just doesn't cut it these days. Voters want bigger change than that, but also voters aren't reading those newspapers, the announceables, the little announceables that have dominated media management in Australia for decades don't count for much anymore. Now, the Prime Minister clearly knows this, and the lead up to the 2025 election, Labor put their health policy out a month or two before the election campaign and then just kept talking about it for a month or two. That's great. That works, because these days where the old-fashioned newspapers and the 6 p.m. news doesn't attract majority eyeballs, just giving an announceable, giving a drop to a friendly journalist to get a headline, well, no one cares, because most people aren't subscribing to those newspapers or watching those TV stations. So if Albo wants to cut through, he has to cut through by doing big things that people care about and convince them that those big things are going to make their lives better. So until his whole government, and indeed governments around the world, can move on from this 1990s, 2000s approach to media management, keep dripping little stories out, keep setting the agenda every day, win the day in the media, that might have worked for Kevin Rudd, but it doesn't work in the age of social media.
So there does seem to be a rise in nationalism or Australia firstism, which One Nation is, I think, plugging into. What can politicians do there, or what can the Prime Minister do there?
Oh, absolutely. In Australia and around the world, nationalism, or the idea that we need to kind of put our country first, is on the rise. And, let's compare that to the sort of globalisation of the 90s and the 2000s, which said the opposite. Free trade was going to fix everything. So, back when I was at uni a long time ago, back when I first started working in policy and politics, free trade, globalisation, all that stuff was going to fix everybody's problems. Now, a lot of people like myself were sceptical at the time, but that's what the Labor Party used to believe, that's what the Liberals used to believe, that's what the Nationals used to believe. And it didn't work. The benefits of free trade did not trickle down. We saw manufacturing get destroyed. We saw offshoring of jobs, and people are rightly skeptical of that. So nationalism is a response to that, and it's a response that Pauline Hanson sort of really does a good job of saying, I told you so. We needed to put ourselves first. But there are other ways to look at this. And, the Prime Minister himself has talked about, progressive patriotism. The idea that, again, we need to put Australia first, but not with the kind of anti-immigration or racial hostility that a lot of nationalists tend to emphasise. But progressive patriotism means a lot more than putting on a Socceroos jersey and, saying, yay, Team Australia. Progressive patriotism means actually implementing policies that look after Australians and that put Australians first, especially when it comes to economic policy and the delivery of services. So the reality is, I think someone like David Pocock is doing a much better job of progressive patriotism than Anthony Albanese by saying things like, well, let's tax the gas industry and let's spend that money on Australians. So that's a version of nationalism. Pocock is clearly putting Australians first, but he's doing so in a way that's got nothing to do with race, but it's got everything to do with how should Australians organise our system in a way that's good for all of us Australians. So, I think the Prime Minister's got the slogan right of progressive patriotism, but he hasn't got the policies to back it up yet.
I think that's all we've got time for, Richard.
Oh, well, thank you. I don't know that we got quite to the bottom of what One Nation is and everything that's going on, but hopefully we've helped people see that it's a bit more complicated than because there's a surge in support for Pauline Hanson, everyone in Australia has suddenly become right-wing and anti-immigrant. I think Australia's a more interesting and complicated place than that. Thanks so much for your questions, Anna. That's all for this week's episode of What's the Point? Make sure to subscribe to this podcast and to The Point at thepoint.com.au. If you've got a question you'd like us to tackle, let us know. You can reach us on Facebook and Instagram. I'll be back on Monday next week, and until then, I'm Richard Dennis, and thanks for joining me.